All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name, as Brian said, is Margot de la Marche. I love 14th century hoods, and I'm going to go over what we're going to go over in this is how they became a thing in the 14th century and then how they ended up at the end of the century. So we're only going to be looking at the 14th century and how they existed and developed and changed in that century. If there's time, I'll show off some of the hoods that I've made myself, but I have a slideshow. We're going to go over it. We're going to look at how it changed throughout the history. So let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. Here we go. Okay. Let me move you guys out the way. All right, 14th century hoods, an overview by me. Okay, so there are a few things that we need to keep in mind before I get started. The unfortunate thing about these hoods is that there are not that many extant examples of them. So that means that 90% of our primary resource for what they looked like, how they were constructed, how they styled them comes from manuscripts and illuminations. And there's a lot of problems with that. Manuscripts often took years, decades to complete. So it's hard to know exactly when certain trends started and when they ended because we don't have an exact date for when that particular illumination was painted. And a lot of manuscripts usually fall in like one of two categories, biblical or allegorical. Biblical manuscripts don't tend to follow normal fashion trends, it seems like. And allegorical manuscripts, there are a lot of things like clothing that they would put on people and fabric styles that didn't reflect what people really wore, but it was more to denote a visual meaning for people who were viewing the manuscript but maybe couldn't necessarily read it. They had meaning, so it can't be trusted in that regard. And then also this timeline is a very sweeping general overview of the fashion as represented in European fashion from the beginning to the end of the century. So I've split it into three categories of the development of the fashion. The first leg that we're going to hit is 1300 to 1330s-ish. You actually don't see hoods that often in manuscripts. And when you do, it tends to be only on the working class. So like farmers and hunters and things like that, people who are outside working. And it's almost exclusively on men. Women are almost never seen in these hoods in the beginning of the century. And women too, when they're painted in the illuminations, are still more dressed in the previous century's style. It kind of hasn't moved over to the typical 14th century style that we're used to. And because we see these hoods on the working class, it's pretty clear that they started as a practical device, a practical piece of clothing rather than fashionable. The poor working class didn't have the time or the money to create fashions for themselves. That's a thing that people with money got to do during this century. And when you do see them, they are a very simple design. They are closed in the front, they fall wide on the shoulders, they don't seem to have any decorations. Very simple. The leery pipe does exist on them, but they're very, very plain and very, very simple. There are a few, like I did say that women are not seen in them, but there are a few depictions of women that seem like it could maybe be a hood, but it looks more like a cap or a cowl as opposed to a hood. It's hard to know because like I said, there really aren't that many excellent examples to begin with. Here are some manuscript finds that I found for you guys. The one on the left, you can see that they're both wearing two styles of hoods. Very simple, very plain. These are people who are working outside. In the center, you can see that they have hood-like, these women have hood-like something or others on their shoulders, but it's hard to know, is this a hood as we tend to think of them in the 14th century, or is it something else? And then on the far right is a woman in a cap that is a little bit reminiscent of the hood, but still very hard to know. And both of these manuscripts are from the beginning of the century. And we move into our second leg. This is the mid 14th century, so we're talking 1330 to 1370s. For some reason that we have no evidence of, we have no written record of, there's a rapid explosion of hood fashion. Everyone is wearing them. It is not only the working class, and it is not only the men. Men and women are seen in them, and you see it on nobility and the wealthy. You see a rapid growth in styles as well. You have them particolored, you have them lined with contrasting colors, you have buttons appear, possible evidence of beading and embroidery, and you have extravagant leery pipes. I say possible beading and possible embroidery because we have not yet found an extant piece that had either of those on it. But when you look at them in the manuscripts, and I believe I have some examples coming up, it looks like it could be representation of beading or embroidery. The hems also become lower on the shoulders, and normally would be dagged. That started in this part of it too. Women started to wear them more. There is, and as bears note, there is a very clear difference between the hoods that men wore, or the masculine people wore, and the hoods that the feminine people wore. Masculine hoods were almost exclusively closed. They did not appear to have any buttoning or any way to bring them together or open them up in the front. Whereas women's hoods were almost 100% of the time open, like the one I'm wearing today, with evidence of buttons. And they were almost always worn over the veil, like I'm wearing mine today. Here are some examples. You have people in hoods on the one on the left side of the illumination, and on the right side of the illumination, you have people in hoods. In the center bottom, you have a couple of different styles of hoods. And on the far right, you do have some feminine style hoods. And here are some more. In the dead center, this is the style that women wore. This was the most common. This is how you see them for the remainder of the century and even into the next century. This is kind of how they stayed: high on the shoulder, open, folded back at the top with a leery pipe. This is how the women wore it, and there's not a lot of deviation. On the left, you see some dagging, and you also see the little white dots along the hem. This is possible beading or possible embroidery. Hard to know. Also, you can see if you look toward his neck where it's open, it looks as though it's lined in a contrasting color. And then on the far right, you see a very extravagant leery pipe on that gentleman there. And then we move to the end of the century. Dagging is out of control, not only with hoods, but everything that they wore was now dagged. Dagged hoods, dagged leery pipes, dagged hems around the tops of the opening of the hood that goes around your head, dagged clothing, dags everywhere. And interestingly, so we began the century where it was a very masculine working class item. And interestingly, toward the end of the century, leery pipes and hoods tended to become more of a predominant feminine trend. You start to see almost 100% of the women wearing hoods, and you kind of see men wearing them taper off a little bit. So men sort of moved away from it, whereas women just took it and ran. And they continue that into the 15th century as well. There is a very interesting style that starts toward the end of the century, where it's this square fronted hood that ties underneath the armpits. And the best guess with that is a practical reason why they started to do that. If you're galloping on your horse, you don't want the hem of your hood to come and smack you up in the face with a big gust of wind, right? So why not tie it under the armpits and move on? Still had a lot of the extravagant hoods. Here are some examples. This is a collection of men wearing a whole lot of different hoods. You can see that some of them are the square style, tying underneath the armpit. You still have leery pipes, you have some without. There are all a bunch of different colors. They're just all over the place with the styles. This is a little hard to see, but almost every man in this image, they are all wearing hoods, and most of them are the square fronted hoods. Here's a statue of a woman. Women wore the square fronted hoods as well, which was very interesting. I sort of thought it would have been a trend that men would have predominantly wore. They'd be out charging on their horses or working and the wind blows the hem up. But you do see this statue here with a woman with what appears to be a square fronted tying under the armpit style hood. And this is the fashion, this is the way that women wore it throughout the end of the century and into the next century as well. You can see there's buttons, but even though there's buttons, you don't hardly ever see them closed. They're usually open. So leery pipes, this is the question that I always get. So the tail, the end of it, the long thing that hangs off the back of your head. I always get questions about that, like why did they do it? What was the purpose? How long should they be? How wide should they be? So what were the rules as to how long or wide that you should make them? There were no rules, none. They could be as long as 3 inches, or they could go all the way to the ground. As for how wide they should be, we have extant examples where they're very, very small, no wider than maybe an inch or so. And there are illuminations where they are very wide. Because if there were rules, this man would have been arrested. This is the widest leery pipe tail that I have ever seen. He doesn't even seem like he can keep his head up. And it goes all the way to the ground. So clearly there really were no rules, just however much fabric you could afford, you can make it that wide. So why did they have leery pipes? What were they for? No one knows. Really, we don't know. There's nothing that says it. There's nothing written about it, and there's no one left who can tell us. So there are a few theories about these, because it started as the hood with the leery pipe tail, because it started with the working class. It's highly probable that it was a practical thing, that it had some purpose. The trends that start with the working class, they have to have a purpose. They don't just do things to do the things, right? Fabric is hard to come by, it's hard to make, it's hard to dye, it's hard to construct. So you're not going to waste the time on something that has no purpose, right? So there's definitely a practical use. One of my favorite theories is that it is used to help dry a wet hood. And I've tested this. If you take a wet hood and you just throw it over the back of a chair near a heat source, it dries unevenly and it gets a funk to it. But if you take and you suspend it by the tail over a heat source, it dries evenly and it doesn't have a smell to it. There's also another theory that it could have been to keep the hood on the head, to keep it from falling backward, by taking the leery pipe and wrapping it around. There's some problems with that theory because some of them weren't long enough to facilitate that. And there's also another theory that perhaps it was something that was left over from the previous century that we don't see a lot of depictions of, or we haven't found any extant examples of yet. Here, I included these are some extant examples on the left. These are dagging. This is done in some broadcloth. I think this is why dagging took off, is because you can cut broadcloth and it does not fray, it doesn't unravel. So you can cut these intricate dags out of them and not have to finish any of the edges. On the right is one of the most complete, well-preserved extant examples of a hood that we have. You see the leery pipe on it. It's long, but I don't think it's long enough to wrap it around your head any number of times. All right, any questions?
So, Margot, we did have a few questions posted to chat.
Okay.
Etienne asked about regional differences on dagging being party-colored and lyra pipes over this century. Were there anything specific to particular countries, regions, etc.?
There are, but it's so nuanced to different regions that it's like, it's a lot to talk about. But for the most part, when you see them in manuscripts, they tend to look mostly the same. There's slight variations, slight differences, but it's hard to know sometimes too if it was actually like a fashion difference, like a variation for this specific region, or if it was just an artistic indulgence, because they're not that different, if that makes sense.
And Mistress Caitlin asked if this was purely continental European or if it was English. It looked like there was mostly continental, but mixed. Where did you draw your sources from?
Mostly just broadly Europe region. And they mostly came from like the big players. So there were a lot of French manuscripts, there were a lot of English manuscripts. They were making a lot of manuscripts at the time. So whenever you go to look up manuscripts, the bulk of them usually come from the English or the French.
And going back to the square hoods, Deborah asked about how they tied under the armpits. Were there, strings added? Was it something additional to that? And she also had a follow-up of what were the hoods and or those strings made out of? Were there any sumptuary laws about who could wear what kind of hood?
So from what I understand, we have not found any extant examples of the square fronted hood. So it's hard to know what they would have been tied with, but my best guess is that it just would have been like braided silk or something made on like a lucette or something like that. Just a piece of nice string that matched with it. As far as sumptuary laws, we don't know. There's not a lot that talks about them. The fabrics that they would have been made out of would be predominantly wool. It is feasible that upper class people would have made them out of linen and silk and things like that, but predominantly wool. And especially toward the end of the century, broadcloth was very popular. And since there was an abundance of dagging, I feel that they would have predominantly been made out of broadcloth specifically.
Aoife asks about pins being on the hoods. As we can see on your hood is attached with straight pins. Was that typical, something like that, or a brooch? And if you're wearing an open hood, how do you keep it from falling off?
That's the pins. There's not a lot written about how to style them. But I figure for me, how I kind of figured it out for myself is since women would wear them over their veils, you have to have a way to keep it on your head so that it doesn't fall or slip backwards because you're putting fabric on top of fabric and it'll slide. So the only way to keep it on your head is some straight pins. And when they don't have buttons, like mine today, it does not have any buttons, which was pretty common about in the middle of the century. To keep it from flying backward, how would you do that too? Well, you'd pin it to your dress.
Aisha asks about dags.
Mm-hmm.
Are those were those one piece with the hood? Were they added separately?
Both. There are examples of both. There are scraps of hoods where you have, it's not an entire one. I don't believe that we have an entire dagged hood in existence, like an excellent example of it. But there are examples where there's enough surviving that it leads us to believe the whole thing was a solid piece with the dags cut out of the hem. And we do also have strips of dag that have been found, extant pieces, where it's cut straight and it's just kind of like a trim, so you could add it up under the hem of a hood.
I remember in one of your examples, there was a line of, it looked like white beading, or it could have been white embroidery. I believe it was on a men's red hood. I can't recall if that one was dagged,
It
but
was.
could that beading and embroidery be a way to help, one, attach, or two, cover the seam where it was attached?
Possibly, yeah, absolutely. I definitely think it could. It's close enough to the hem that that is definitely a thing that could have been done for sure.
Great, thank you. And we did have a few people come in a little bit late. I know this was covered at the beginning, but someone is asking to if you could go back over the differences between men's hoods and women's hoods.
Yes. So men's hoods, when you see them, almost 100% of the time are closed in the front. I have an example I can show you of a men's style hood I made, where this is the opening of it, the face, and down the front is completely closed along a seam. It does not open. It lays flat across the chest, no opening, no buttoning. And then women's hoods, like mine, were almost 100% of the time open. You do see some examples of women with closed hoods. This seems to be more toward the beginning of the like middle, so 1340s to like 1350s. You see a few examples of women with their hoods closed, but it kind of peters off towards the end where women are almost exclusively open hoods with or without buttons.
That is all the questions we have in chat right now. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Were dags ever seen on women's hoods or just men's?
I have seen a few examples, but not enough to support it as something that was fashionable and widespread. And then two, like a point that I brought up in the beginning, most manuscripts are either biblical or allegorical, and a lot of clothing device choices that they pick denote something, especially with allegorical manuscripts. There's a lot of fabrics that they have that were never fabrics that existed as far as we know, like patterns on fabrics, but they mean something because you see that motif repeated on specific types of people. So who knows? Maybe they did, because there's only a few examples of women wearing dagged hoods. I like to think that they surely would. They dagged everything else. I don't know why they wouldn't dag their hoods too, just like the men.
And those few examples, were those open front hoods or closed?
Open.
Okay, interesting.
Which I have some examples of those as well.
I seem to recall seeing a reference that prostitutes were seen wearing what they called a raid hood. Do you have any idea what that meant?
I have not heard of that. I'm
not sure what period it was.
Mm,
Oh, striped. Okay. Thank you.
maybe it's possible. I know that there were different like striping and like coloring techniques that did denote something. I remember learning about veils that would have along round veils that along the hem would have a blue dyed strip, and that would be it would denote that you were a Jewish woman.
Oh, well, Mistress Caitlin says in the chat that raid means striped, so that answers that question.
So it's possible that women of the night might have had specific striping or coloring patterns, because we do know that that was a thing that they would do where you would have certain things that meant certain things on your clothing. Possible.
Can we see an example of a woman's dagged hood? Because they're just so darn pretty.
A couple of them. I have this beautiful red one here with the dags on the bottom. I'll also bring the dags closer so you can see them. And down the front of it is buttoning, so it does open with nice buttons. This would have, it's also dagged around the hood front, which is something you can also see evidence for in some illuminations, where you have just little scallops at the the opening. I have another one as well that is a feminine style hood where it's open in the front with the buttons, and I have the dagging on the bottom. They're little oak leaves with embroidery. And again, we don't have, there's no extant examples with embroidery. So me putting embroidery on these is 100% speculative because of what I've seen, how they're painted in the manuscripts. It seems as though there is embroidery or maybe beading on them because of the way they're painted. But we haven't found any examples, so it's kind of up in the air whether they embroidered them or not. Any other questions? Oh, I see some more.
So in chat, we have Mistress Caitlin asking about hood lining. Were they lined? What was the lining made of?
It's hard to know what the lining was made of. We don't have any lining examples surviving. I think they would have been lined. We started to see that in the middle of the century, where it's clear that they're lined because you'll have the outside of the hood be one color, and then the parts of the hood that are open that we can see would be a different color. And I think the main reason why we haven't found any extant examples with lining is I think that they very likely would have been lined in linen. Wool tends to survive, linen does not tend to survive. Fur, oh, I saw that fur. I haven't seen any evidence of fur. I haven't seen any illuminations that look like it has fur in it, but there are some things that were fur lined in that century. I know sideless surcoats would often be fur lined. I don't know if they would have fur lined the hoods. I haven't seen any examples in illuminations that look as though it's representing fur.
And Aoife asks, would hoods be worn with a separate cloak?
Yeah, we see examples of that as well, where it does appear as though there is both a hood and a cloak. Very often they're depicted as being the same color. So it's very difficult to definitively say that, yes, these are two separate things and not just a one item. But there is a distinct kind of cut, like you can see a detail where it looks like there's a hood laying on top of the cloak. And then there's, it was in the slideshow and I probably went past it really, really quickly, but towards the end of the century, there were these very interesting like cloak-like gowns that women started to wear, where it was the bell of the hood was extended all the way down.
Hillary asks about color. Are there traditional color choices, particularly due to dye sources?
I think mostly the things that are available to them. I do think, this is just a theory of mine, at this time, okay, so in the manuscripts towards the middle of the century to the end, you see a lot of people wearing red hoods. But we know that light, fast red, like red, we did not have the technology yet. Not in Europe. It was in other places, but the Europeans had not discovered it just yet. So we also know that there was no language difference between red and orange. They did not distinguish between the two of them, but they had the ability to dye things orange, and they had very vibrant traffic cone orange. So I think that the depiction of all of these red hoods are actually just vibrant orange hoods, and I think that that was probably the most popular color.
Craig mentions that he has found written accounts of fur-lined hoods.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Maybe not in manuscripts, but written.
Oh, good.
Elsewhere.
Good. I mean, I think that, yeah, it makes a lot of sense because they lined a lot of other things in fur There's a lot of sources for sideless surcoats lined with fur. So a lot of fur lining. So I'm surely they would do that as well. And it's written, so they did.
And Hillary mentions the deep orange that is Ansteorran iron or dirt.
Yes, that could have been a popular one as well. They end of 14th century. Well, there was no distinguishing between red and orange. They really considered the same color. So they had red pigment to paint. So definitely it could have been just some burnt orange, and that was popular. I think orange was the hot color for hoods at the end of the century. That's my theory, though. I don't have anything to back that up, friends. Sorry. Anything else? I got through it a lot quicker than I thought I was gonna.
That is all the questions we have in chat. Anybody else? Questions for our instructor?
Oh, I see another question. Were the leery pipes themselves dagged? Yes, we have evidence of leery pipes with very extravagant dagging on it, which is super cool.
And Hillary does ask about a handout.
I did not create a handout, but if you are interested in any sources, or if you'd like me to send you my slideshow, I can do that as well if you ping me.
Aoife asks about lining. Did the lining extend into the lyra pipe?
No, it's impractical to do that. Maybe they did, but I've made a million of them, and it would be very bulky and a waste of fabric to extend it into the leery pipe. It's an enclosed tube. It doesn't open, so there's really no reason to line it.
Nobody would see it.
Yeah, you wouldn't see it. It's just a waste of fabric, a waste of time. Just on the inside of the hood. So when you would cut the fabric, you'd cut them at the same pattern, but only your outside fabric would have the tail. And a lot of times the tail was attached at the back of the hood instead of being cut in a continuous. And that's probably just to save fabric.
So it certainly wouldn't have been something that was like fully reversible.
Right, it wouldn't be reversible because of the tail. But there are examples of hoods that did not have leery pipe tails. They just were flat in the back, or they had like a cute little like Smurf kind of tail. Those could definitely be reversible if you kind of finagled it just right.
And we have someone asking about patterns for hoods. Where can they find patterns?
There I used what is it, the Medieval Tailor's Assistant. There's a wonderful pattern in there that explains the math behind it, because it's really, you just kind of measure your head and then create it around that. But there are, Aoife has it, the Medieval Tailor's Assistant. There really are, though, two particular patterns. If you're making the feminine style, it always has side gores at the shoulder to create the bell. If you're making a masculine one, almost predominantly, they were cut just out of a single piece of fabric without adding any gores to them, which also helped to facilitate dags, because it's very hard to make dags in seams. So less seams, the better.
Going back to the lyra pipes, or was anything ever added to those bells or tassels other than the dagging?
None that I've seen. The only real decorative thing that was created with them was dagging on them. And there really aren't too many examples of people dagging the leery pipe. So for the most part, when you see the little tail, it just tends to be a straight piece of fabric.
And someone is asking if you could put your email address maybe in the chat in case they're not on Facebook.
Yes, I will do that. So you guys can email me if you'd like literally anything. I have a hard drive full of manuscript PDFs.
And someone has also posted a link to scaling patterns.
Oh, wonderful.
Anetia from North Shield has posted that is actually an Ansteorra resource from one of our northern brethren. And Philip mentions that in Fashion in the Age of the Black Prince, there is mention of embroidered hoods in some accounts of Edward III, and including some from France. So it's apparently been written about, even if there's been no extant examples.
Oh, good. Yeah. And we see it in the illumination. So I don't think that those poor scribes have so many things to paint. I don't think that they would just put some superfluous designs on there. So definitely, yeah, embroidery.
I apologize for coming in late. I was getting into a discussion on a Facebook group and I was late. So if you've covered this, I apologize. I'm fascinated looking at the picture of lovely you with how much band and veiling and stuff you have underneath the hood. I mean, I have a similar hood to that and it's like, I plop it right on my head. I don't even put a coif or anything underneath it. Is that consistent to what you're seeing in the manuscripts, that there was a lot of veiling underneath the hoods?
Yes. Whenever you see feminine depictions of the hood, they're always on top of a veil. But hey, it's your hood. You can wear it however it makes you happy. If you don't want to throw on a veil and put your hood on over it, it's a lot. It's hard to kind of turn your head because it is a lot of fabric. It's like the cap and then the veil and then the hood, and it's a lot of fabric. And this hood is lined as well. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of fabric on my head right now, and it's a lot. But
Yeah, I just have the black linen that the turn back is also black. That is, I think it's Très Richer, and it's one of the winter months, and the lady of the house is sitting next to the fire and warming herself, and her servants, who are completely exposing themselves, are farther from it. But that appears to be smack on her head. Do you know the one I mean?
I'm not for sure. Would you email it?
Yes, I will.
And someone has asked about, in one of the pictures, it looks like there was a hood, but that a man was wearing that had a cap on top of it. Can you go over some of that fashion?
Yeah, they would wear caps on top of it too. They would wear hoods with the hood down, and then they would have like their bicocket on top. So it's like a hat with a hat, and yeah, they'd wear it on top too with a hat and a hat and a hat. It's a lot of hats, but they would do it. I don't know why. I wish I could ask them. It's very interesting because this is already a lot, and I'm trying to imagine putting a bicocket on top of over this. That's a lot. But I suppose if it's cold.
That mini ice age helped, I'm sure.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And someone has asked if you would mind going back through the manuscript examples that you showed.
Sure, I can bring up the slideshow again, and we can go through the examples. I have a lot of examples. I really had to cut it down because there was way too many. So let me share that, and we'll go back through. If I can, here we go. Okay. Okay. So these are some examples towards the beginning of the century. I don't have that many of them because, like I said, they really weren't you didn't see them that often. So it was really hard just finding these 3 images. And then I have these for the next leg of the century from the 30s to 70s, where you have some hoods, and these examples as well. And then I have these. These are the square front kind. And I have these ones as well.
That last example, sorry, that last example also shows 2 different styles of hats on top of the hoods.
Yep. Yep. There's a lot. They just put anything on their head, it seems like. But it's fun. Yeah, they just wore hats on top of hats. I don't know why. I guess, yeah, in mini Ice Age, you're right. You would definitely need warmth. So why not wear a hat on top of your hood? Why not?
Yeah, several people have pointed out that it's February, and I put the link to in the chat to the one that.
Oh, I see it. Let me look. Oh, yes. Oh, I have seen it. I've seen it zoomed in on just the woman with the black cap, the black hood. And that's the typical way that most women would wear their hoods, where the opening was so far back that it really wasn't even possible to close it had you wanted to. Like this one is like that. Let me move my veil out of the way and you can see where the opening is so far back that even if I wanted to close it, I couldn't. So towards the end of the century, that's kind of how the feminine hoods progressed. And then when you move into the next century as well, they just continued further back, where even if you wanted to close it, no, not happening, which honestly makes a lot of sense. Women wore a lot of veils, even under the chin as well. And the wimple, you wouldn't be able to close it anyway without stifling yourself with fabric.
So at that point, was it pure fashion and not practical? Whereas it seemed to begin as a practical piece of clothing?
Yes, it definitely moved from practicality, we need this, to it's just cute, we want it. And it still had a purpose as well because it did keep you warm, but they did take a lot of creative liberties with it, which tells me that it no longer really served a practical purpose. It was just something cute that also happened to keep you warm.
Are there any other questions? If not, I'm going to go ahead and stop the
All right.
recording.